Okay, what I'm going to do now is to move on to the second part. As the advert says, this is the science part. Okay. Cognitive science, things which can happen to stop meetings operating effectively. The Quaker Business Method approach actually manages to mitigate many of these. Okay. That's the plan. Cognitive science, which I've been teaching and studying and doing research in now for some decades, combines artificial intelligence, psychology, linguistics, is applied into education and also used in anthropology in order to explain human activity, human cognition, human thinking. It's a science of how humans process information. Okay? And it ranges, looking at phenomena at timescales from sub-second down to, say, 100 milliseconds, all the way through to what humans do, up to, say, a decade. So the phenomena which cognitive scientists may study may actually take a decade to develop, such as expertise. But what underpins all of these ideas is the fact that we're receiving, storing and retrieving, forming and transmitting information. So cognitive scientists basically break down all human activity into things which do these basic forms of information processes over different timescales. I think ideas about all of the ones listed here, both in black and grey, can be used to try and identify hurdles to making good decisions, solving problems, but also potentially provide at least partial explanations for why the business method might work. What I'll focus on is memory, psychological biases, problem solving, and social dynamics. What I'm going to do is, for each one of these processes, I'm going to think to what extent there may be things in the Quaker Business Toolkit which will counter the problems that arise due to the way that we just think and behave, or they may exacerbate those things, okay? or both. So again, this is a systematic decomposition again. Okay? So memory, there's lots of aspects of memory. We could even have a short course on memory, so I'll keep it short and just pick on two parts. Okay? So primacy and recency effects, basically, let's imagine a meeting, okay? And ideas are being presented over time within the meeting. Okay. Then which ideas are likely to be remembered if you were to ask people after the meeting what ideas were presented? And this is a well-established phenomena that the primacy effect, things which are presented early on are remembered, things which are presented late on are remembered, and all the stuff in the middle is forgotten. Okay? And so there's this natural process that distorts the information which we have available and which we might use to make a good decision. Right? So does the methods, Quaker Business Methods, actually try and work against this in some way? There's very thorough accounts of the way that we remember things in cognitive science. Okay? And so I think we're all used to the idea of one idea is sort of associated with another idea in mind. So if I say red and emergency vehicle, that's likely to cue fire engine for you. Right? Or if I say red and fruit, you might say strawberry or apple. But few of you would say jumbo jet as the association. So things are disconnected. Right? And so what we can imagine is that supposing you've got this complex network of experience and ideas, and you have a solution in your mind to a particular problem, right? And you're sat in a meeting, and somebody proposes an idea here, and so all of this network sort of represents your past experience and ideas. Okay? And so what's going to happen is there are certain links, certain ideas which are tightly linked, and other ones which are more weakly associated, and others which are completely disconnected. And here we have a train of thought of recalling and memories to get an idea as an output from a particular input. And of course, as we're going along this path, what might happen is certain ideas which are triggered by side thoughts which we've had they contribute to this particular output. And so the more ideas that people contribute, the stronger you focus on this one solution. But what about all these other great ideas down here? How do we access them? What I've done is to take these ideas and say, okay, in terms of silence, does that help or not? Well, maybe silence would actually help because it allows people not to be captured by the ideas that people are just throwing in. So you can sit in silence and then some other idea might just naturally pop up because it's not in competition. Okay? So that's a positive. But the primacy and recency effects mean then that the longer the wait, perhaps, then the more likely you are to forget things which are early on, especially the clerk. The clerk is given the explicit role of trying to think about writing a minute. Okay? And so they are rehearsing and keeping alive previous ideas and trying to integrate them. So maybe the clerk's role keeps alive some of the ideas in the middle which would have otherwise been lost. Right? Being open-minded clearly is, even though someone else has said something, you've got it in the back of your mind, no, I must think something else. I must bring new ideas to the table, and it's fine and good to do so. That mitigates against some of the problems of limited memory. Having pre-meetings, of course, could explore ideas more widely, but bring just one idea or two ideas to the table, which then everybody then fixates on. And the corporate values is a way of stepping back from the ideas which are being considered and take a fresh look from a different perspective. That may be a beneficial thing. Psychological biases have been studied very extensively. You can think of them as the difference between sort of reflexive cognitive actions and deliberate reasoning. The way it's been recently characterized by Daniel Kahneman is as sort of system 1, system 2, fast thinking, slow thinking, which from your nods I see that some of you are aware of those ideas. There's a small industry, maybe a large industry out there of psychologists looking for cognitive biases. I would say that it's a pretty good summary of cognitive biases, even though it is Wikipedia, and that normally I would say to students be extremely cautious. From a perspective of processing information, what kinds of things might interfere with rational decision-making, good decision-making? One aspect is memory. Our memory is really not set up well for making abstract, rational decisions, but for our hunter-gatherer origins. And we're fighting against that all the time. To summarize information to help us adapt and survive is a function that we do all the time. And there's a tendency for us then to generalize too much and to generalize everything that we see. So take one or two examples, make it general and believe that it's a law without thoroughly having tested it. It's another possibility that if there's too much information, we might just focus on certain details, especially if they are particularly salient. If we have to act fast, what we might do is, rather than consider all of the options, how do you in that case do you make a decision when you have to act fast? Well, probably you will favour something which is familiar to you. Or there could be a situation where there's too little meaning. Okay? And in this case, it could be we actually don't know what's in the mind of other people, but we often think we do. Yeah? In everyday life, but also in meetings. And how often do you actually explicitly, when somebody says something which is halfway ambiguous, stop and say, no, what did you really mean? Okay? Rather than assuming that it was negative or positive in a way that satisfies your own particular disposition. Okay? So in terms of psychological biases, what do the tools do? Well, maybe the silence helps us think more rationally. Rather than making it just a quick, intuitive reaction to an idea, we'll actually try and think it through. And certainly the idea of having a pause so that your immediate emotional reaction to what can decline, and then there's space for you to think about it, maybe this is a good thing. The role of the clerk is also explicitly to try and think about all of the information. The training that the clerk will have had through experience may naturally mean that they don't just naturally react to what they've just heard. And so this is similarly with the process of discernment, to be open-minded. And if people bring that to a meeting, it's possible that they will be more willing to entertain other ideas. Similarly, the corporate values, again, try to work against these psychological biases. In terms of open-mindedness, it's when you feel a resistance against an idea, that's when you should be most on your guard that there's a bias coming in. Okay? And if you are aware of this happening, you can see other people saying that I was first very much against this idea, but now that I've reflected on it, you can then build the kind of culture that would allow ideas to flourish. So my favorite theory from cognitive science is problem solving as heuristic searching. It's a bit more technical and complex, but I think it is even more powerful than the idea of biases. And the idea here is to actually formally define what a problem is, and then to use that formal definition in order to then determine what is an effective problem solving, and then what, for example, would be creative problem solving. Creative problem solving needs no mysterious process in order to explain it. You start off characterizing a problem as some kind of initial state where you are. You have no solution, and what's important is there should be some solution criteria which you're going to satisfy in order to solve the problem. So this is the definition of a well-structured problem. There are states, ideas which you generate as intermediate states, and there are operators, particular inferences that you make in order to generate further ideas. And notice here what we have is a branching tree. So there are lots of different lots of different inferences that you can make from where you are with your initial state. Right? So part of the idea of problem solving is to find those paths that would get you to a solution. And there may be more than one solution that satisfies the criteria. So effective problem solving is really a matter of finding those paths which are relatively short and actually manage to get you to a solution rather than all of these unprofitable paths. Effective problem solving is also sufficiently sampling the whole tree to know that your solution is at least decent, to try and satisfy in terms of exploring enough so that you satisfy the criteria, but you don't do an exhaustive search of all the possibilities because there's no time to do that. So how would we explain creative problem solving? Well, creative problems are often ones where there is no initial state, but often you don't know what kinds of inferences or what kind of information you need, and also you often don't know what kinds of conditions you have in order to satisfy the problem. Creative problem solving is actually to generate a new problem in which your problem pops up a different level, and it's the problem of finding the criteria for the solution. Actually go to a different space where you actually think of different moves that you can make within the well-structured space. Okay? And so the studies that cognitive scientists have done is actually shown this dance amongst different spaces. And even the process of scientific discovery, you can classify in terms of a search of a space of theories and a search of a space of possible experimental results, and then you combine the two, and they mutually constrain each other. So what are mysterious processes apparently can actually be explained quite rationally. So the clerk has an unenviable task of trying to keep tabs of all of the different avenues that have been searched in the problem space. Okay? And if the clerk themselves fixates too much on just one path or closes down contributions too early, the whole space may not be thoroughly explored. Okay? But then again, the clerk is trying to get some sense of what the overall space is in a way that not everybody else is trying to do. And so maybe then picking out the one or two paths which are the best paths amongst all of those that have been explored is what the role of the clerk is meant to be about. Having different kinds of minutes which you're going to write. So being clear up front, do you need a decision or do you just need to explore the idea and not make a decision, is one possibility, not to have fruitless conversations because you have a clear goal. Having the silence allows perhaps different parts of the tree to be searched because you could restart from somewhere else rather than carrying on digging deeper and deeper. Okay? So a silence and a break allowed you perhaps to reset and backtrack to somewhere earlier. The idea of open-mindedness can promote wider search. Given the amount of time, I'm not going to try and talk about each one of these links. Okay? The third aspect which I'll talk about is social dynamics. Right? And there's been a lot on this. Work, for example, by Milgram in his famous experiments on electric shocks, the notion of groupthink. Lots of work on don't do brainstorming. It's not a good way of generating ideas. Right? So if anybody really likes running groups that does brainstorming, there's much better ways to do it. One experiment carried out by Ash, what are the circumstances do you get conformity in a group? Right? So imagine you're in a meeting, and this meeting has the really arduous task of deciding which of these three sticks is the longest. You are the last person, and you've been set up, and all of the Confederates have been primed to say, it's C, it's C, it's C. Are looking at them thinking, what, is their eyesight terrible? And so the great temptation is also just to say C, to go along with the crowd. Here is a participant, they broke into a sweat because there's so much tension between the social environment versus the cognitive environment, where then discounting their own eyesight, maybe I've not understood the rules properly. The answer is really C, but I'm not smart enough to know what the answer is. A participant says C, and this is a picture from the original one, and if I could zoom in this poor character, the stress on his face is really quite intense. Right? You can easily break this phenomena by, if you have fewer Confederates, but if you have just one other person who says, no, actually, I think it's B, you will say B if one other person said B. Okay? It's enough. Right? And so this is the basis of the groupthink. Take these ideas about social dynamics and look at the mappings. Exploring new ideas, being open-mindedness works towards counter these social dynamics. Okay? The idea of also discernment as well can counter some of these social pressures of which are. Let me summarize. So in terms of memory, psychological biases, social dynamics, for each one of these tools, what we can do is say whether it mitigates it or it doesn't. And so this is my own personal interpretation. There's no empirical evaluation here. This is just my observations and also what it says in Faith and Practice. And by all means, play this game for yourself. If you have a look and see, how would you fill in this matrix? And certainly for me, and I could be biased here because I've sat in many meetings and maybe I've been socially influenced by being amongst many Quakers in those meetings, but the majority of these potential problems may well be mitigated by one or more of these tools. So that's my scientific analysis of why the business method might work.